Alright, so this is going to be part 7 to what if Deku had John's powers from an ordinary. So with that being said, let's just roll the intro. In my newest 2 videos and on my community tab, videos are not going to come out daily like they used to because I'm doing more editing into my videos to make them a little bit higher quality and to make them a little bit smoother so that people can actually stop complaining about the uhs and the pauses and things like that, which they have a right to complain. That is a thing that I've been trying to change. I couldn't do it on my own, so obviously there's gonna be parts where I still stutter a bit, so I have to cut that out in editing, which I've been doing. So I hope you guys appreciate what I've been trying to do and the time it takes to make these videos, since it is a lot longer because it's just editing and trying to take out pieces. And you can see that in my community tab how many cuts I have to do for a video, and this one's gonna be a little bit longer since it is going over the movie. And yeah, I'm gonna try to make it, or try to do it as fast as I can. This is obviously pre-recorded, so it's not gonna come out on the same day that I'm recording it. It's probably gonna take maybe 2 or 3 days for me to edit it. With that being said, our story would begin, I believe, right after the heroes versus villains, or not heroes versus villains, the teachers versus students. So if you don't know, this is the time period in where the movie actually starts. So yeah, it would start off with All Might and Deku in that private jet, and where they're talking about how they're going to Island. And this is where Deku would basically ask All Might and tell him, All Might, is this okay for me to, fly with you? And this is where All Might would be like, nonsense. We're connected by something stronger than blood. And they're talking about one for all in this instance. So Deku doesn't really, bring up the subject again. And eventually they get to Island. This is where they would get off and go to through security. Also, you guys wanted the name Joker as the hero name, so I'm gonna go with that. So yeah, after this they would get into the main part of the area, or the island, and this is where a tour guide would see All Might, and a bunch of fans would come to see All Might, just how they do in canon. And this would take a bit of time since there's just so many people there. So after a bit, this is where All Might would be done talking to his fans, and he would basically go with Deku and explain that they're here to see a friend of his. And as they're kind of walking and talking, this is where a person on a pogo stick would actually come by, and this person would just keep on hopping closer and closer until she jumps off of the pogo stick into All Might's arms. And it turns out that this person's actually Melissa, which is not All Might's friend, but actually the daughter of his friend. So All Might would introduce Deku to Melissa, and they would get to know each other. So at this point, Deku is still kind of not trusting of other people because of how he's been and how he's been treated. So she would inspect him just how she would normally do, and kind of look at his costume. And yeah, I don't remember how his costume was. I don't think I gave any specific details on how it should look, but given the fact that Deku can copy a lot of different powers, he doesn't really need that advance of a costume. So I would think it'd be more simplistic in his design, something similar to his original design, but I guess a little bit different in colors, maybe black and orange, kind of just how John's is in canon and things like that. So I think she would kind of critique it a bit, saying that it doesn't have too much defense. And this is where Deku would be like, well, I don't really need defense with my kind of quirk. And she'd be like, oh, really? What's your quirk? And he would say, or manipulation, but it's more like a copy quirk. And she'd be like, oh, that's interesting. That must be really exciting to be able to copy so many quirks. And Deku's kind of getting irritated by this because he's not really used, or he is used to getting compliments for his quirk, but he doesn't really like it because he sees people as kind of fake by doing that. So he kind of takes it with a bit of, I guess, salt, and doesn't really take the compliment too well, but he keeps it with a smile because he's trying to change his ways. So All Might kind of sees this, and this is where he would bring up the fact that I think Melissa was quirkless. Yeah, he would bring up that fact to Deku, basically saying that, oh, Midoriya, she's a great scientist here trying to be like her dad, and she's quirkless too. This is where Deku would basically have a little bit more, I guess, tolerance for her in the ways that he wouldn't get as annoyed because she is quirkless, and he does find people who are quirkless to be more innocent, I guess. to people who are or have quirks because they are kind of power hungry in his eyes. So they would continue and they would get to David's lab, and this is where All Might would introduce his friend David Shield to Deku, and Deku would recognize him since he is a very notable scientist, or a very famous scientist, I should say. So All Might would have his reunion with David Shield, and this would be the point where All Might would be losing a bit of on his time limit. His time limit would go down a bit and he would cough. This would signal David to have Melissa go and take Deku around to show him across the island. So that would happen, and All Might would go into that machine and David would test out his quirk levels, while Melissa and Deku would just go around the island looking at different gadgets and things like that. So we would get to the part where they're in that kind of aquatic center where they're showing off all the different gadgets you would have for underwater purposes, I guess. So this would be where the other students from class 1A would come, and Momo and the two others, that being Uraraka and Jiro, would come, and they'd be kind of surprised to see Deku there, since Deku isn't really someone they would expect to be there, since it is really exclusive. Also, he is kind of a loner in their eyes because of how he acts and his kind of personality. In this one, I try to make his personality a bit more, I guess you would say, kind of like a dick. I guess you would say that, because he isn't someone who is a straight up good person, you would say, but he would still want to be a hero, but he's not really a good person. I guess something similar to Endeavor, but not to the same extent, because you know all the things that happen with Endeavor and things like that. So they'd be like, oh, Midoriya, you're here too? And this is where he would turn around and be like, oh, it's you three. Like, he wouldn't be glad to see him, but at the same time he's not like too angry or irritated that they're here. Just kind of a passive, or not really passive, but an indifferent kind of response. So this is where they would see Melissa with him, and this is where they would assume that he's actually on a date with her, and I don't think they would get jealous in this one. I think they would be somewhat proud of him to see that he's opening up to people. So they'd be like, oh, did we interrupt something? And Deku would look and realize the situation, and I don't think he'd be flustered. I think he'd be kind of that kind of cool and collective type. So it'd be like, oh no, you got it mixed up. And they'd be like, oh, so what are you doing here? And this is where Melissa was about to say that All Might actually got him here, but again, since him being All Might's kind of successor is a secret, Deku would take her aside and basically say, you know, keep it a secret. So Deku would come up with the excuse that he was the first place in the Swords Festival, so he was able to get a free pass here. So they would believe this and they would continue, and this is where they would eventually go to that kind of area where they would get smoothies, or not smoothies, but they would get drinks. I forgot whether or not Mineta was in or was the one taken out of this class or not. Alright, so I just checked and he wasn't, so they would still meet up, like I said before, at that kind of place. So I checked and he wasn't, so everyone in class 1A is still the same, so they would meet up at that kind of area so they could get drinks, and this is where they would hear explosions. They would also meet up with Ida here since he was in the general area. So when they get to the sound of explosions, this is where they would find both Bakugo and Kirishima. So the reason why Bakugo was able to come is because he got second place during the sports festival and Kirishima was his +1. So just like in canon, Bakugo would get around, I believe it was like 13 seconds. So they'd be all interested in like who could get the highest, and this is where Uraraka would basically tell Deku like, how about you go and try it, since you know you could copy everyone's quirk. So Deku's kind of, he's like, no, I don't want to do that. But then Melissa's like, well, I think it's a good idea, you know, you could test out the limits of your power and see how far you could go with it. And eventually Deku's like, fine, I'll go. And Bakugo sees that he's there and he gets kind of angry. He's like, Deku, what are you doing here? And this is where Deku's like, well, it's none of your damn business. And he would be like, oh, Bakugo, what was your score? And this is where Bakugo would be like, well, it doesn't matter because you're not going to beat it. So this is where Deku would be like, well, just watch me. So he would copy Bakugo's quirk, and this would basically make it where his explosions would be a lot larger, just how they were in canon, or just how, you know, Bakugo's like explosions are. They can be a lot bigger, plus all for one, or one for all, I mean. giving it that boost. So he'd be able to get through it pretty easily, faster than normal, because Bakugo's explosions got him there pretty fast. So let's just say with all this, he'd probably get around 7 seconds, I would say, combining all those other factors with the increase in the quirk as well as one for all. And I don't think at that point he would have seen any other quirks really other than Kirishima's, and that wouldn't really help too much. Ida didn't really show his, and neither did Todoroki yet, because Todoroki would come after Deku, and this is where he would get around 13 seconds, I think, or a little bit quicker than Bakugo, and then Bakugo would try to go again and get a better score. So after Todoroki and Bakugo do that kind of race, this is where everyone would say hi to Todoroki, saying like, "Oh, Todoroki, you're here too?" And he would just reply, "Yeah, since my father's the number 2 hero at this point, because All Might's still not out of retirement, or not into retirement yet, he was able to get a free." So after this, they would go back to the kind of food court that they were at before, and this is where they would make that agreement to meet up later at the tower so that they could all go at once for the reception. So after a bit, this is where I think in this case Melissa would still take Deku to her room to show her, or to show him, the full gauntlet so that he could use it, because he's able to copy quirks, and if he needed to copy All Might's quirk, then he'd be able to use it without any real repercussions. So he'd be thankful for this, and he would ask her like, "Are you really quirkless?" And Melissa said, "Yeah, I've always been quirkless since I was born," right? And Deku is kind of more sympathetical towards her, because in his mind she isn't someone that's out for glory or real, like she isn't power hungry like most quirk users are in his mind. So she then continues talking about how she wants to basically be like her father, like a great scientist, but she doesn't really know if she could do it. And Deku would say, "Well, all you have to do is just keep on trying, and eventually you'll get there," because he knows the struggles of being in a situation where you're looked down upon by others and not being able to keep up, or I guess the best way to put it is to be underestimated, I guess. So she would really appreciate that, and then they would look at the time and they would realize that they're gonna be late, so they would get changed and they would all head out. So when they get there, this is where Ida would be like, "Yo, does anyone care about punctuation? You guys are almost late." And Deku would be like, "Sorry, there were some things that came up." And Ida would be kind of surprised at Deku actually saying sorry. He would take a step back and then, accept his apology. This is when the rest of Class 1A's girls would come in their dresses, just how they would normally do, and Deku would actually compliment them, saying that they look nice, as like a general kind of compliment towards all of them and not into one specifically. So he's kind of trying, but he's also at the same time not trying to get too close to them. So the reaction towards all 3 of them are pretty much a less. They're like, they just take it as a compliment. They're not really too flustered by it. So after this is where Melissa would come and Deku would say the same thing, or I guess he'd be slightly more personal with it. I think he would say, "You look beautiful," instead of just saying "you look nice," which I guess the girls would seem rather strange coming from Deku in this what if, especially since he was so kind of distant between them. So after this, they would try to go through the door, and this is where the actual shutdown would happen, where everyone would be locked out and the villains would come and take over the party, just how they do in the movie. After this, they would think something's wrong, so they would go through the alternative way and they would go upstairs to get to the 2nd floor, and this is where they would look down and they would see All Might. All Might would see Deku, and then he would mutter some words, and this is where Jiro would use her earphone jacks and use them to basically hear what All Might's saying, and he would say that there are villains here that are taking hostages, and he wants them to basically stay out of it and call some backup. So Jiro would tell us the rest of the class and Melissa, and at this point they're thinking like what they should do. So all of them don't really know what to do. Ida thinks that they should maybe just wait and get some people or get heroes, and Melissa said there's not really a good way to contact anyone outside the island. So Deku thinks that they should actually help, so everyone agrees and starts walking up the stairs. Eventually they would get to a roadblock and they wouldn't be able to get past the door. Mineta would then open up a door that was right next to them, and this would lead them into that kind of, I guess, greenhouse where all the plants are, and they would continue to walk down or walk through it, and then they would see these villains. They would then hide because they don't really want to get into a fight, and the villains start talking. They say, "Kids, what are you doing here?" And at this point Deku thinks that they're found out, but it turns out they're actually talking to both Bakugo and Kirishima. And Kirishima's just there asking for directions, just how he normally does, but the two villains there actually start to fight. Todoroki uses his ice to block it, while he pushes the rest of the class upwards to get to the next part so they could shut it down and free the heroes. So since Deku saw Todoroki use his powers, he would have copied it, and since he did copy Bakugo's from earlier, and I said that the duration for his quirk or his copy quirk is going to be a week of him able to like store it up, then he's going to be able to use it later on. So right now he only has both Bakugo's and Todoroki's quirk at this point. So they would go out that kind of catwalk and they would reach to a point where they couldn't really continue, but they see this kind of hatch on the ceiling, so they decide to have Mineta go up there since he is the smallest and it is the easiest for him to get through. Or a little bit before that, they would have went into that kind of room with a bunch of robots. Kaminari would have tried to use his shock or his electricity to take out the robots. It wouldn't really work. He would become dumb, and Ida and Deku would have to go and fight off the robots, which they would successfully do. Then they would continue to the server room where this all kind of happens, where Melissa tells them that they can't really do that much damage here since there are a bunch of servers here, so it could really mess up the island. So they decide that they should have Momo, Jiro, and Ida here to basically stop whoever or stop the robots while also not doing too much damage to the servers. They have Deku and Uraraka as well as Melissa go so that they could go to the higher floors, the top floor, and turn off the security, since Deku can copy any quirk and Uraraka's not really that well at fighting in terms of her quirk. It's not really a combat quirk, so it's more utility, so it might help them get to the higher floors better or quicker. So they would go and they would get to the top. Uraraka would use her powers to launch Deku and Melissa, or I guess Deku could use one for all, and the explosions that he has to basically launch himself and control it. And when the robots come and Uraraka has to basically let go or let go of using her powers and let herself float, she isn't as hesitant because Deku would have said it was okay since he does have both Todoroki's and Bakugo's, so it's easier for him to continue his flight. But Uraraka doesn't actually do that, since this is when Todoroki and Bakugo would come to save her, and this would also be where Deku would get help from Todoroki to basically use the wind, the hot air, to push him to the side so he could get into the building. So he would use one for all, specifically with the gauntlet. Not really because he needs, or I guess he would still need to, since it does kind of break his bones when he uses 100%, since his version of one for all would be stronger than it is in canon. So he would do that, and he would break down the wall, and this is where I think it was Sword Kill would come. First he would go for Deku, and then he would miss. Deku would hit him in the guts and push him away, thinking that he would be kind of out. This is where he would cut Melissa, and Deku wouldn't really have any mercy on him. He would use an explosion to basically push him back and then freeze him to the point where it would go off to his neck and actually threaten to actually push him off the ledge. And this is where Melissa would be like, Midoriya or Izuku, you don't have to do that. It's only a cut. And then he would say like, this is he's a villain. He doesn't care about you. He would have killed you if I wasn't here. And Melissa doesn't really argue that point, but she still says it's like, you're a hero. You're not supposed to kill when you don't need to. And Deku's like, you're right. I'm not. At this point, he's kind of hesitant not to, but he still leaves him. He doesn't leave him frozen because that would kill him also due to, frostbite, just how like Todoroki says. So after that, Deku would knock him out, and he would know his quirk since it would be shown trying to cut Melissa, so he would have copied that as well just in case he needed it. So they would get to the top, and this is where David Shield is actually giving, or not David, I think it was Sam taking out the quirk enhancement device, and this is where Melissa would see that her father is actually betraying the island. So Melissa would be in shock, like, Dad, like, how could you do this? And David Shield would then go into a speech about how his funding was cut and how they told him to stop because of how the society could change. But then he says that he created the device so that All Might could use it and regain his power that he's been losing, and then the symbol of peace can continue saving people. Deku does kind of feel a little bit guilty because he took the power, or he was given the power, and that's why All Might is kind of losing his. So as this is going on, this is where Sam actually portrays David, talking about how David never really fought for them to continue their work. So he decided to go with the villains, and this is where the villains actually betray him and basically take the device. Deku actually is getting angry because they shot Sam because of it. This is where David would actually try to wrestle the gun away from Wolford and also get shot as well. He would rush towards the villain, Wolford, and Wolford would use his magnetism powers to basically push metal towards Deku. So Deku sees that he has some sort of power over metal, so he doesn't use Sword Kill's quirk since that is metal. So he uses the explosions to basically blast himself through the metal, and then he basically uses the ice to block it from them, which does work for a bit. And Wolford basically thinks, to get out of here since he wants to take the scientists and leave. Deku then tells Melissa to go and shut down the security system, so she goes and runs to do that. But then this is where the henchman actually tries to stop her. So Deku, what he does is that he uses his ice to block the henchman, and Melissa continues to go. This is where the villain Wolford would actually start to leave and go up to the building, or top of the building. So when they get to the top, this is around the same time that Melissa was actually done hacking or really turning off the system. This would free the other heroes, which would give All Might a chance to get to the top and help out Deku. At this point, Wolford would have reached the helicopter and would have been started to fly away with David's shield and the quirk enhancement device. Deku would be really persistent and would use One for All to jump as high as he could, similar to how he does in the movie, but a little bit further, since I think he would, like I said before, he would be able to use more of it and his percentage would be a lot stronger. So he would also use his explosions to help him get up as high as he could, and he would have the power of magnetism to pull down the plane, or not the plane, but the helicopter, since he would have copied Wolford's quirk. And Wolford's surprised, like, why does this kid have so many quirks? Because he would have seen the ice and the explosion, so he doesn't know what's happening. So he would pull the helicopter towards him, and Wolford would obviously try to, hold it back up, right? But since Deku's quirk is to also enhance them, while copying them, he would have lost, and Wolford would have been brought down, and Deku would have gotten David's shield while the helicopter crashes into the building. So they all think it's over, and by the time All Might gets there, David would have been saved, and right when they're about to celebrate their victory and things like that, this is where Wolford actually comes out of the rubble wearing the device. So the way that Deku's quirk would work in this instance, I don't think he'd be able to copy the enhanced versions of the quirk since it isn't their base. I think he would have to copy their base, or if he were to copy it, then he would copy the base form or the base version, nothing like that's enhanced by any device or drugs. So that's how I would say it would go. So Wolford would use the device, and he would become that kind of giant, or he would surround himself with so much metal, just how he does in the end or in the movie. And this is where All Might and Deku would have to go and fight him. So as he's throwing pillars and pillars of metal, they start running up them, and they keep going faster and faster, and Deku's using full cowl at this point. So both All Might and Deku start running together, and they jump into the air and they do a Detroit Smash. Deku combines this with his explosions to make some sort of explosive punch, and he uses 100% on his hit since he's using the full gauntlet. This would break the full gauntlet even though he only used it maybe twice. It was so powerful, combined with the fact that he has a stronger version of One for All and that he has explosions. This basically breaks the gauntlet, and Wolford is promptly knocked out and is arrested later on. So yeah, this is where I'm going to end the video. Remember, if you liked the video, give it a like. If you want to watch more of my content, subscribe, and remember to comment down CS so I know that you support the channel whenever you comment. So with that being said, this is gonna be the video. So yeah,